What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors faces off against a seasoned political journalist who thinks he can corner him on live television? What you're about to witness is the moment Denzel Washington decided he'd had enough of being talked down to, and the explosive confrontation that followed will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about morning television. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really happened here, because this is one interview that nobody saw coming. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studios in Times Square. The crew was setting up for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. Denzel Washington was scheduled to appear on the show to discuss his latest directorial project, a film that had been generating serious Oscar buzz. The actor arrived early, as he always did, greeting the production staff with his characteristic warmth and professionalism. George Stephanopoulos was already in makeup, reviewing his notes with that familiar intensity he brought to every interview. His research team had prepared the usual talking points about the film, Denzel's career, and his upcoming projects. But George had something else on his mind. He'd been following some recent comments Denzel had made about the entertainment industry and political activism, and he saw an opportunity to push buttons. As Denzel settled into his chair across from George, the two men exchanged pleasantries. The cameras weren't rolling yet, but you could feel the tension building. George had that look in his eyes, the same one he got when he was about to grill a politician who'd been caught in a scandal. "So Denzel," George began once they were live, "let's talk about your new film. But first, I have to ask about some comments you made recently about actors staying in their lane when it comes to politics. Some people found those remarks a bit surprising coming from you." Denzel's expression shifted slightly. This wasn't what they discussed in the pre-interview. "Well, George, I think what I said was that we should be careful about using our platforms responsibly. There's a difference between having an opinion and having expertise." "But isn't that a bit hypocritical?" George pressed, leaning forward with that prosecutorial stance he was famous for. "You've been quite vocal about certain social issues over the years. Are you saying actors should only speak up when it aligns with your particular viewpoint?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Denzel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm. "I'm saying we should all think before we speak, George. Something that seems to be in short supply these days, especially in media." George's eyebrows shot up. "Are you suggesting that journalists don't think before they speak? That's quite an accusation to make on a news program." "I'm not making accusations," Denzel replied, his tone still measured but with an edge creeping in. "I'm making observations. And my observation is that sometimes people in media are more interested in creating controversy than seeking truth." The studio fell silent, except for the hum of the cameras. Even the crew members who'd seen thousands of interviews could sense something was different about this one. George's smile became more forced, and his posture more aggressive. "That's interesting coming from someone who's made a career out of playing characters who bend the truth," George shot back. "Tell me, Denzel, when you played corrupt cops in films like Training Day, were you making a statement about law enforcement, or were you just, as you put it, staying in your lane as an entertainer?" Denzel's eyes flashed with something that made the camera operators lean in closer. "George, let me explain something to you. When I take on a role, I'm telling a story. When you sit in that chair, you're supposed to be reporting facts. The difference is, I'm honest about what I'm doing." "Honest?" George's voice rose slightly. "That's rich coming from Hollywood. You want to talk about honesty? Let's talk about the entertainment industry's relationship with truth. You've all gotten very comfortable lecturing the American people while living in your ivory tower." That's when Denzel's composure began to crack. Not in an explosive way, but in the methodical manner of a man who'd been pushed too far by someone he was beginning to lose respect for. "Ivory tower? George, do you know where I grew up? Do you know what I've seen, what I've lived through?" "I know you've done very well for yourself," George replied with a dismissive wave. "Multi-million-dollar contracts, private jets, gated communities. It's easy to have opinions about the real world when you're insulated from it." Denzel leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, everyone in the studio thought he might just walk away. Instead, he leaned forward, fixing George with a stare that could have melted steel. "You want to talk about being insulated? Let's talk about network news anchors who've never had to wonder where their next meal was coming from. Let's talk about journalists who think they understand struggle because they covered it from the comfort of their air-conditioned news vans. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Production assistants were glancing nervously at each other, wondering if they should cut to commercial. But the interview was compelling television, the kind that makes careers and breaks reputations. George, sensing he was losing control of the narrative, decided to double down. Denzel, I think you're deflecting here. The question is about responsibility. You have a platform that reaches millions of people. Don't you think that comes with an obligation to be more than just an entertainer? The only obligation I have, Denzel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, is to be truthful. To myself. To my craft. And to the people who support my work. I don't need a lecture about responsibility from someone whose job is supposed to be informing the public, but who seems more interested in gotcha moments. George's face flushed red. Gotcha moments? I'm asking legitimate questions here. The American people deserve to know where public figures stand on important issues. The American people deserve honest journalism. Denzel fired back. They deserve reporters who ask real questions instead of trying to manufacture scandals. They deserve better than this performance you're putting on right now. The words hung in the air like an accusation. George's carefully crafted professional demeanor was beginning to slip, and everyone in the studio could see it. This was no longer an interview between a journalist and his subject. This had become something else entirely. A confrontation between two men with very different ideas about truth, responsibility, and respect. George's face was now visibly red, his professional mask completely slipping as he realized he was being outmaneuvered by someone he'd clearly underestimated. The veteran journalist had interviewed presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders, but something about Denzel's calm intensity was throwing him off his game in a way that was becoming embarrassing to watch. Performance? George's voice cracked slightly. I've been doing this for over 30 years, Denzel. I think I know the difference between journalism and performance. Denzel tilted his head, studying George with the kind of analytical gaze he brought to his most complex characters. 30 years of what exactly? Because what I'm seeing right now isn't journalism. What I'm seeing is someone who came into this interview with an agenda, and when that agenda isn't working out the way you planned, you're getting frustrated. My agenda is getting answers, George snapped, his composure continuing to deteriorate. Something that seems to make you uncomfortable. Your agenda, Denzel said, his voice gaining strength, is trying to create a moment that will go viral. You're not interested in my film, you're not interested in my work, you're interested in getting me to say something that will generate headlines. And when I don't play along with your little game, you get defensive. The camera operators were now zooming in tighter, sensing that they were capturing something extraordinary. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in how media manipulation works, being exposed in real time by someone who refused to be manipulated. George's hands were now clenched on his desk, his knuckles white. You know what, Denzel? Maybe the problem here is that you can't handle tough questions. Maybe you're so used to people kissing your feet in Hollywood that you've forgotten what real accountability looks like. That's when something shifted in Denzel's demeanor. The controlled calm was still there, but now it was backed by something more dangerous, a quiet fury that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. Accountability? Denzel's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more power than if he'd been shouting. Let me tell you about accountability, George. Accountability is showing up to work every day and giving everything you have to your craft. Accountability is being honest with yourself about your motivations. Accountability is not using your position to ambush people who came here in good faith. Ambush? George laughed, but it was a hollow, nervous sound. This is a news program, not a promotional platform. If you can't handle real questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Denzel stood up slowly, and for a moment, everyone thought he was going to walk off the set. Instead, he remained standing, looking down at George with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and contempt. Real questions. Denzel repeated. Okay, George. Let me ask you a real question. When you wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror, are you proud of what you've become? Are you proud of using your platform to try to tear people down instead of building them up? Are you proud of the fact that you're more interested in creating conflict than understanding? George's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time in decades of television, the veteran journalist was truly speechless. The roles had completely reversed, and now he was the one being questioned, the one being held accountable. "I don't have to answer your questions," George finally managed, his voice shaky. "You're the guest here." "You're right," Denzel said, nodding slowly. "You don't have to answer my questions. Just like I don't have to sit here and be disrespected by someone who's forgotten what integrity looks like." The studio was dead silent except for the mechanical whir of the cameras. Even the crew members had stopped moving, transfixed by what they were witnessing. This was television history being made, and everyone knew it. George tried to regain control, turning to the camera with a forced smile. "Well, folks, it seems like we're having a bit of a heated discussion here with Denzel Washington about the role of celebrities in political discourse." But Denzel wasn't finished. "No, George. That's not what this is about, and you know it. This is about respect. This is about professionalism. This is about the difference between journalism and ambush tactics." George spun back to face him, his facade of journalistic objectivity completely abandoned now. "You want to talk about professionalism? You're standing over me, raising your voice, acting like some kind of victim because I asked you tough questions." "I'm not raising my voice," Denzel said, and indeed his tone remained controlled and measured. "I'm standing because sitting across from you was making me feel complicit in whatever this is supposed to be. And I'm not a victim, George. I'm someone who refuses to be victimized." The distinction hit like a thunderbolt. Even George seemed to recognize the power of what Denzel had just said, because his next attack was more desperate, more personal. "This is exactly what's wrong with Hollywood," George said, his voice rising to match his frustration. "You people think you're untouchable. You think you can lecture the rest of us about morality and social justice. But the moment someone challenges you, you fall apart." Denzel smiled then. Not a warm smile, but the kind of smile that appears when someone has just revealed more about themselves than they intended to. "I haven't fallen apart, George. I'm still here. I'm still answering your questions, even though they're not really questions, they're accusations wrapped in question marks. But here's what I want to know, since we're being so honest with each other. When did you decide that your job was to tear people down instead of seeking truth? When did you decide that creating controversy was more important than creating understanding?" George's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he found his voice again. "My job is to hold people accountable, especially people with influence." "No," Denzel said firmly. "Your job is to inform the public. Your job is to ask questions that help people understand the world better. Your job is not to create drama for ratings or to make yourself look smart by trying to make your guests look stupid." The conversation had moved so far beyond the original premise that the producers were frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but George waved them off. He was in too deep now to back down, his professional reputation hanging in the balance. "You're lecturing me about my job?" George's voice was now openly hostile. "You're an actor, Denzel. You pretend to be other people for a living. What makes you think you understand journalism better than a journalist?" Denzel looked at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of genuine sadness. "Because, George, I may pretend to be other people, but at least I'm honest about it. You're pretending to be a journalist while actually being something else entirely, and you've convinced yourself that it's the same thing." The words hung in the air like a death sentence for George's credibility. Every person in that studio knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. George's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to anger to something approaching panic as he realized how badly this was going for him. "How dare you question my integrity?" George said, his voice now trembling with rage. "I've won Emmy Awards, Peabody Awards. I've interviewed every president for the last 20 years. I don't need to justify my credentials to some Hollywood actor who thinks he's smarter than everyone else." Denzel remained standing, his presence commanding the entire studio. "Awards don't make you a good journalist, George. Questions do. Curiosity does. Respect for truth does. And right now, you're showing me none of those things." George shot up from his chair, finally losing all pretense of professional decorum. "You want to see journalism? Fine. Let's talk about your past, Denzel. Let's talk about some of the choices you've made, some of the people you've associated with. Let's see how you handle real scrutiny. The threat was unmistakable, and everyone in the studio felt the temperature drop several degrees. But instead of backing down, Denzel stepped closer to George's desk, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. Go ahead, George. Do your worst. Dig up whatever you think you can find. Because here's the thing about living with integrity. You don't have to worry about people examining your life. You welcome it, but can you say the same? George's face went pale. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Denzel said, his eyes never leaving George's face, that when you make threats like that, you better make sure your own house is in order, because the internet works both ways, and people are watching this right now. And they're going to have questions about why a supposedly professional journalist just threatened to destroy someone for not playing along with his games. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in for George. In his anger and frustration, he had just made a threat on live television that would be replayed and analyzed by millions of people. His career, built over decades, was crumbling in real time. I wasn't making threats, George said weakly, trying to backtrack. I was simply pointing out that public figures should expect scrutiny. No, Denzel said firmly. You were making threats because you're losing an argument, and when bullies start losing, they always resort to intimidation. But here's what you don't understand, George. I've been dealing with bullies my whole life. I grew up with them, I've worked with them, and I've learned how to handle them. George's breathing was becoming more labored, his desperation more obvious with each passing second. You're twisting everything I'm saying. This is supposed to be about your movie, about your career. You're the one who turned this into something personal. Denzel laughed, but there was no humor in it. I turned this personal? George, you started attacking me the moment we went live. You came at me with loaded questions, accusations disguised as journalism, and when I didn't crumble the way you expected, you got angry. This whole thing has been personal from the beginning. You were just better at hiding it then. The studio audience, if there had been one, would have been on the edge of their seats. Even the hardened television professionals working the cameras and soundboards were mesmerized by what they were witnessing. George made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over, talk about your film like we originally planned? But Denzel was already shaking his head. No, George, you don't get to do that. You don't get to attack someone's character, question their integrity, make veiled threats, and then pretend it was all a misunderstanding when it backfires on you. George's voice became pleading. Denzel, please. This is live television. We can work this out. We could have worked it out, Denzel replied. We could have had a respectful conversation about my work, about the industry, about important issues. But you chose to make this about something else. You chose to turn this into an ambush, and now you're upset because your ambush failed. The silence that followed was deafening. George stood there, his reputation in tatters, his professional demeanor completely destroyed, while Denzel remained calm and composed despite everything that had been thrown at him. Finally, Denzel picked up the small microphone clipped to his jacket and set it carefully on George's desk. I came here to talk about storytelling, about the power of film to change hearts and minds. Instead, I've been subjected to whatever this was supposed to be. I think the viewers deserve better than this, and I know I do. George's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire career explode in front of him. For what it's worth, Denzel said, his voice softening slightly, I hope you figure out what happened to you, George. I hope you remember what made you want to be a journalist in the first place, because this person I'm looking at right now, this isn't a journalist. This is someone who lost their way and forgot what their job was supposed to be about. With that, Denzel Washington turned and walked off the Good Morning America set, leaving George Stephanopoulos standing alone at his desk, the cameras still rolling, capturing every moment of his humiliation. The control room was in chaos, with producers screaming at each other about whether to cut to commercial or keep rolling. But the decision was taken out of their hands when George, perhaps realizing that millions of people had just watched his professional suicide, looked directly into the camera and said, "We'll be right back," his voice barely audible. As the show cut to commercial, The studio remained in stunned silence. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented in television history. Not just an interview gone wrong, but a complete dismantling of everything George Stephanopoulos had built his reputation on, performed by a man who had simply refused to be intimidated. The aftermath would be swift and merciless. Within hours, clips of the confrontation would be all over social media, with hashtags supporting Denzel trending worldwide. George's handling of the interview would be dissected by media critics, journalism professors, and ordinary viewers who had watched a respected actor maintain his dignity while a veteran journalist lost his completely. But in that moment, as the studio lights dimmed and the crew began to pack up their equipment, one thing was crystal clear. Denzel Washington had just taught a masterclass in how to handle a bully, and George Stephanopoulos had learned a lesson he would never forget about the difference between journalism and performance. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Did Denzel handle this the right way, or should he have walked away sooner? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this that show what really happens when the cameras are rolling and people think nobody is watching.